Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a nerdy romance and women's fiction author. She is the author of the Accidental Lovers romance series, which currently has 2 books published, The Accidental Swipe and The Accidental Proposal, and she is also the author of Secret Second Chances and Owen and Makayla Retelling. Her name is Y.M. Nelson, and my interview with Y.M. will follow the note-taking sounds. Y.M. Nelson, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Oh, hi, listeners. I am Y.M. Nelson. I am a romance and romantic women's fiction author, podcaster. Back in the day, I was a blogger. And I have a couple of day jobs on the side, too.
2 of the 3 books you have published at the time of this interview are in the Accidental Lover series, The Accidental Swipe and The Accidental Proposal. Without spoiling too much of both of those books, what are each of them about?
Well, they are essentially, because I do have that, there's a fine line between romance and women's fiction for me. I have to have a heavy dose of both, but they're essentially 2 a serial, I should say, character stories, starting with Fortune's story, The Accidental Swipe, where she is looking to she's a jaded lover, one half of this jaded lover couple that will eventually happen. No, that's not a spoiler. I write romance. We always deal with HEAs. So she is looking to find someone to go with her to a gala. And the guy side of the couple, jaded lover, Jason, he is just looking to find someone that can be with him throughout. So it follows the Accidental Lovers. It will be a trilogy. It follows kind of their journey. Part 1, The Accidental Swipe, is how they met. Part 2 is how they deal with some friends. So we'll save the rest of that so we don't spoil it.
Your other book that's currently republished, it's currently published at the time of this interview, is Secret Second Chances and Owen and Makayla Retelling. Without spoiling too much about that book, what is it about, and will it be part of a series of books?
So this is interesting. At the time of this recording, I have decided that, yes, it will be part of a series of books. Interesting kind of journey there. I wanted to start my the publishing part of my writing career by just putting out a story. At that point, I had decided to self-publish, and I just wanted to put out a story. That story was a romance centered around Owen and Makayla, and it started off with 24 Hours of Freedom, which focuses on this couple of friends. This is a friends to lovers romance. So a couple of friends are getting back together for their 20-year college reunion. And one of the friends, Owen, finds himself in a bit of legal trouble, and he is potentially going to be arrested. So 24 Hours of Freedom was kind of how this started. It was a short story, and it just focused on the 24 hours before he is actually arrested. And after I put that out there, just to kind of see what was what, people said, where's the rest of it? So I eventually wrote 2 other parts to that, but then realized that Owen and Makayla as writers do sometimes, our characters talk to us, and Owen and Makayla were saying, we need more of a story here. So I last year 2024 I expanded on their story and rewrote a lot of it. So there is the legal aspect, there is the friends to lovers aspect, there's also the second chance, obviously that's in the title, second chance at love aspect of it. But there's a whole lot more to it, and they are still getting back together for their 20th college reunion and what that brings up. And yes, Owen is still in some legal trouble, so we'll see how that turns out. So there's one caveat there to kind of their backstory as I was writing Secret Second Chances, um, is that I noticed that they were just, I realized that I had downplayed the fact that they were in this group of friends that was just a nerdy group of friends. And, they call themselves the Nerd Herd. And no, that's not from Chuck. It just kind of came to me. But the show Chuck. But I decided that this would be a standalone in a series of books that show nerds in love, or folks in love that are doing nerdy and geeky things. So that's kind of how the series part developed from uh, just a short story. What started out as a short story, it's now a series. Yeah. Or going to be a series.
What motivates you to write romance and women's fiction, and what is women's fiction?
Oh, okay, good. That's a good question. A good question, but a very bad to me name for what women's fiction is. So, first off, definition of women's fiction is um, fiction, story that the must or the basis of the story is a character's emotional journey. So, the main character of any women's fiction story is that they go through an emotional journey. So they start one place emotionally at the beginning of the story, and then they go through a lot of things that puts them in another place emotionally, whether that's a happy or satisfying place or whether that's a understanding emotionally. It just depends on the story. Women's fiction has also been called lately, because the name is problematic, women are not the only ones who have emotional journeys. Women are not the only ones who write women's fiction. So a lot of people have called it relationship fiction. They've called it all kinds of different things to kind of get around the whole women's fiction notion. But the main part about that is that there is an emotional journey, or the main character or characters go through an emotional journey. What started me writing romance, and what I realized was also romantic women's fiction, is I really just I loved love stories. I started writing when I was in middle school, writing for fun when I was in middle school, and I loved love stories. Um, I didn't see myself in a lot of those love stories, so I wanted to write love stories where I saw myself represented. And so that's kind of how things have evolved for me over my writing career. I realized that yes, I was writing love stories, but I'm also writing stories about women going through things, or main characters going through things, because in the accidental proposal, it's really Jason's story. So he's going through an emotional journey. Um, so I wasn't just writing love stories or romances, I was also writing women's fiction. So that's kind of how that came about. It was partly writing and understanding what I was writing. And then as I was trying to get representation and then eventually deciding to self publish, it was also about researching the publishing industry and knowing how to market a book and realizing that, hey, some of this is not romance, some of this is also romantic women's fiction. So, um, that's kind of how that evolved.
This next question is one of the probably the most open-ended question of the interview. What is the
Mhm.
writing process like for you?
For me. Oh wow. Um, it's changed over the years. Um, but it usually starts with um so this is the surreal part, I guess, of the whole being a writer kind of thing for me. It usually starts with either I've dreamed something or a character is talking to me and won't shut up in my mind. So I have to write down whatever it is. It's usually a dream or I'm seeing like a scene play out in my mind because I think it's more so that than hearing a character first because I'm a visual learner, always have been. And so after that, I have to write that out. And I usually write that out by hand. For those out there who know the whole pantser, plotter, whatever thing, I am by nature a pantser. I just write it out when I feel like it. You know, part of this has to do with the fact that I have a couple of day jobs where, you know, they make me money. So I'm not always on a deadline. I'm on my own deadline, but I'm just kind of writing scenes out as I see them. But I will say once I started writing these series and seeing these series, I've done a lot more plotting after that initial writing out of the scene and kind of getting things out of my head, you know, with these characters and getting back to, you know, what is this story about? Then I have actually kind of started plotting so that I can keep pace in the story, so I can have a good story structure, everything there that a reader will want versus just me writing out, oh, these characters did some stuff. And then also during that process, I am kind of trying to figure out who my character is as well, so that first draft is usually a mess and it's usually in Scrivener um, because I'm writing out of order um, a lot of times, and Scrivener is good for moving things around to put them in order. And so that's usually what happens. That's how the book comes out.
Are all your books independently, traditionally, or hybrid published, or did you use different publishing methods for your books?
All of my books that I have now out now are independently published. They are self-published by me. I did go the traditional route when I first started shopping the manuscript that I was working on. When I first started shopping that around or doing query letters, going on the query train, as writers say, um, I realized A, that was frustrating, and and B, I realized that there wasn't a lot of representation for what I wanted to write, and a lot of the especially the romance writers that are writing because this being well, actually, all of my books that I have out now are considered interracial romance. Um, and a lot of those authors that are really big in interracial romance are publishing, still are publishing independently and self-publishing. And so I thought, well, I think I'm going to self-publish and see what that entails. So I did research first to see what that was all about, what that meant. At the time, that was around 2017. So, Amazon had already, um, gone from bookstore to we're going to sell everything under the sun. Ingram Spark was starting to climb on board the indie publishing train. Well, already had climbed on board by 2017, the indie publishing train. And um, at the time, there were success stories out there. So I figured at least I can get my book out there to see, um, what that entailed. And that's also why I ended up publishing 24 Hours of Freedom, just to do that as a test story. Um, I also found when I was doing that, I really liked doing all those little things. I mean, there's a lot of little things that you have to do as an independent publisher, especially if you are um, an independent publisher and you're the only one in your business doing it. You have to get an editor, you have to get a cover designer, you have to, pull marketing together, and a lot of that stuff I did like doing. And so I think for now, at least, I will probably keep self-publishing because I do like doing a lot of that work. Formatting a book now is so much easier than it was in 2017. And there are a lot of resources out there that can help you and with the things that, you may not know, which, there are a lot of things that I still don't know, but I'm glad there's a robust community out there that you can go to and find help.
My next couple of questions are going to be about some of your other ventures. You host the Nerdy Romantics podcast,
Yes.
and I will include a link to that in the text description of the episode once it's published. What can listeners expect from a typical episode of your podcast?
A typical episode of Nerdy Romantics podcast uh, has changed a little bit over the years. I started Nerdy Romantics podcast in November of 2020. Um, and I did that just because I wanted to, really. And because I was actually trying to find a little bit of kind of my brand and what I liked. But it started out being just me talking about books, just me solo talking about books. There are some episodes that will still be me talking solo, but most of my episodes involve co-hosts who most of them are longtime friends, and we talk about romance, novels, sci-fi, fantasy, and superhero novels, shows, movies, also romance shows and movies sometimes. We have a couple of other indulgences that don't go in there, but most of the episodes are usually group chats where we're talking about a movie or a book that has come out and we're reviewing it. We usually review and rate based on Goodreads 5-star rating. And lately, I've also had a few authors come on that have books that are kind of in that same realm of books that we talk about. We like romance that is diverse and and romantic women's fiction as well. That's diverse and talks about that shows diverse representation, those kinds of things. Um, and so some of the books that I have on, or some of the authors that I'll have on that I'll interview them. I've usually read their books and found that they kind of align with what we're talking about. But what we like to do is combine nerd pop culture and romance. So fantasy romance, romantasy, that's kind of a big thing now. We talk about relationships in Star Trek shows, those kinds of things. So you might get an episode that's all nerdy, but you might also get an episode that's all romance. And then you might get an episode that we talk about the nerdy and the romance together.
In addition to your work as an author you and a podcast host, you also run the Weekend DI Girl website. I think it's a blog, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, it actually started as a blog, hashtag Weekend DIY Girl. It started as a blog. It is still a blog. It expanded in 2022. It expanded to YouTube. Um, but what I'm finding is that Weekend DIY Girl, she's going to have to take a seat to YM Nelson right now. Um, but her blog will still be there, and a few we still have a few videos that we want to put out on her YouTube channel. So yes. Basically with Weekend DIY Girl, I started off just kind of documenting my journeys. I was a fairly new homeowner, and I was documenting my journey doing DIY things. I'm a crafter. I really love crafting. So showing off my craft projects. I've done a few things with those. But yeah, mainly it's been DIY and home improvement kinds of things, upcycling furniture, those kinds of things.
You mentioned nerd pop culture in an answer to one of your previous questions, and that includes stuff like Star Trek and the like. How did you become interested in some of the more nerdy aspects of pop culture?
Yeah. As you know, it's funny kind of how this happens. So as I as I began writing in middle school, that was also kind of around the same time as that was around the same time that that X-Men, the animated series that's now had as of this recording, it's in one season it's had a reboot, but a continuation. But X-Men, the animated series, was one of those things that I also used to watch as a kid, like coming home from school. I would watch X-Men. I would write. And two, with X-Men is one of those things that's, yes, is superhero and it's super nerdy, but it also has in the background of it relationships. And that was kind of a big deal for me, like how these people related. I mean, there's a huge love triangle between Wolverine and Cyclops and Jean Grey that just goes on for, decades. But I got interested in superheroes through X-Men and kind of through what they were saying through that show. And then around also a little bit after that, or around that's actually around that same time, or a little bit before that, to be honest, a little bit before that, I also fell into watching Star Trek. Part of the reason why I did start watching Star Trek, and this is Star Trek The Next Generation, um, the reason why I did start watching that was because of Whoopi Goldberg's character as Guinan, and seeing her on that show, representing on that show, was a big deal for me. Also, with Star Trek, there's a lot of relationship aspects to Star Trek as well. So it's amazing how you see not only a lot of the universal themes that, as social themes and themes about what it means to be human in sci-fi and in superheroes or fantasy. But you also see that there's always a relationship factor there. So that's kind of how that kind of came together in my mind. But Star Trek, The Next Generation, and X-Men, the animated series, are the reason they're my gateway drug. They're the reason why I am a nerd and why I talk about nerd pop culture things. They just open the door.
I only have a few minutes left in this interview, but I have one final question. Are you a bigger fan of Marvel or DC, and why?
Oh, I'm gonna say this. I'm a bigger fan of Marvel right now because I love what they are doing with their universe and the way they've connected characters and connected stories in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For those who know me, you probably know that I'm not a comic book nerd. I am a superhero nerd. That means I don't read the comic books, but I consider them as canon and I respect them as canon. But DC, to me, I think I've been a longer fan of DC and I love the characters in DC. I just wish they had right now more continuity. And I'm hoping we see that with the James Gunn iteration of the DC EU.
YM, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Aaron. This has been great.
It was wonderful to interview YM, and as always, I'll include relevant links in the text description of this episode. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.